I'm not supposed to talk about guns in church because that's political. And I'm not supposed to talk about leaders who would pay more allegiance to the NRA than to the needs of children in this nation. I'm not supposed to say that because that's political. And I'm not supposed to say something like the Second Amendment needs to be repealed and replaced because it's outlived its usefulness, it doesn't fit us anymore. I'm not supposed to say that because that's political. I wonder if it's political to talk about 19 fourth graders and 2 teachers gunned down in their classroom by a kid who shouldn't have had a gun in the first place and certainly shouldn't have had it there. Is it political to talk about that? Is it political to say if the children and grandchildren of Congress people were in that classroom, they might change their mind and something might happen to stop such things finally from happening? Is that political? Is it political to grieve that that deeply troubled young man who killed those children and those teachers was not seemingly at some point gathered into a compassionate community that could have helped him deal with his demons, so that maybe instead of coming into a classroom later on to kill children, he might have come in to talk about how his life was changed by people who loved him and cared for him? Is it political to talk about that? To hope that? Is it political to grieve the fact that we have resources for all kinds of things and we can create all kinds of weapons, but we don't have resources to help our own young people deal with their issues so that they can live well and be healthy and not hurt one another and not hurt themselves? Is that political? Is it political to pray that we'll find a way to change our social fabric and our political system so it's responsive in times like this and actually can change and make this a different world for our children, for our grandchildren? Is that political? Stick to prayer, preacher. Stick to prayer. That's what you do. Is it okay to pray for those things? Or is that political? At the end of this section in John's Gospel in chapter 17, there's 5 chapters in the upper room that John tells this story. It's called the Farewell Discourse of Jesus. 5 chapters worth. We're at the conclusion of that today. I read that section to you. And so, how does Jesus conclude this long teaching session over dinner, over the Last Supper? He prays. He prays aloud, because sometimes prayers are meant more for the people that they're offered on behalf of than they're meant for the God they're offered to. You know what I mean? So what does he ask? In this sort of circular, repetitive fashion that could be its own chant, its own teaching chant that you could learn, that all may be one in me as I am in you, as we are one together, that all may be one, that all may be one in you, God, as I am in you, and you are in me, and you are in all of us, that all may be one. It's really interesting and rather cool. Now, given John's unique theological perspective, his Christology, it's called, it's elevated. He has a high Christology in theological language. He says that not only was Jesus a messianic figure, but that he was God incarnate, God in the flesh, which Jewish people really had and have a problem with. And he said not only was he God with us, but he was in the unfolding story of salvation. He is the one calling the shots. He decides what happens when. It's not the Romans, and it's not the Jewish officials. It's nobody else. It's Jesus decides when the hour has come to do what needs to be done. And not only is he the one who makes those decisions, and not only is he the one who is God with us, but he is the Word of God that was before time. He is the one through whom God is speaking the new creation into being. That's what's going on in Jesus, John says. God speaks and it happens. Jesus is that embodied creative Word through which a new world is born. And that's what's going on here. With all of that, one would have to conclude that Jesus is of a very different order than you and I, right? He's out of our league, like way out. There's no connection at all. And yet, the prayer is what? That my followers may be one with me in you, that we may be one, that the world may, knowing this oneness, that my followers might join in this dance of divinity, this exercise in eternal energy moving all the time, that those who follow me might enter into this and become part of it with us, with you and me, God, that they may know you as I do, that they may experience your glory as I do. That's pretty fabulous. And down the road, we get this doctrine of the Trinity, and there's this Greek word called perichoresis that talks about this divine dance. And the Trinity is not static, but it's energy moving all the time, and Jesus is inviting us into that. That's pretty cool. And it's something that John has developed, and it may be a whole school of thought that has developed that comes through in his gospel over those 60 years since Jesus' life. Rich stuff. It makes not only for a high Christology, but for a high lifted up humanity, potentially, does it not? But there's a bump in the road in this for me as I listen to this. As Jesus prays this prayer, that all may be one, that all might come into the oneness of you and I, God, why is that? What's the reason for that given? That the world may know that you sent me, so that the world will know that you sent me into the world. Now, that's always bothered me. Why is it important that the world knows that God sent Jesus? Would Jesus be concerned with such a thing, do you think? That's what's always stopped me, because from my perspective, Jesus is not about Jesus. Jesus is about God. And that's what makes him, in a way, a good Jew and an exemplary human being. He points to God, not to himself. And I've said this before. I had a Bible professor in college who said, Jesus the proclaimer became Jesus the proclaimed. That's what happened in the early church. And so we get it kind of confused. But I wondered if Jesus would pray such a prayer that the world would know that you sent me. And what strikes me is that maybe this is a continuation of John's argument, the Gospel's argument with his Jewish siblings, praying through Jesus that God might pick them up by the lapels and shake them until they get it, that we were right about Jesus all along. And make them admit it, God. And that might be part of it, because family arguments are hard to stop, aren't they? And yet, I think there's a deeper purpose here that I hadn't really picked up on before. It can be kind of thick. Why is it important for the world to know that Jesus was sent into the world by God? So that the world might understand that God's way is the way of Jesus, that God's way is the way of the cross. Ours is not a God who raises armies and stomps in and conquers and breaks things and punishes people and destroys and kills, murders. Although God has been painted that way, our God in Jesus is one who dies, who gives God's life that we might have life and might be lifted up anew, who gives God's own life in love for the world to bring the world into completeness in this life that is eternal. That's our God. So is that what Jesus is praying for? That the world might come into this oneness, knowing that the way to become whole is through giving ourselves away, offering ourselves to one another in love. That is what is the saving grace of God that we're called to live, that we live in. What happens if the world gets that? What happens if you and I get that? That's big. That's transformational. That's revolutionary. And I think it's that central concept, that motif, that makes Christianity still powerful. And when we live that, it changes things. It changes the world. It really does. Not that it's easy. Jake was 15 months old, and he was dying. And there was no cure, and there was no treatment, and there was nothing that could be done except to keep him comfortable. Now, his family is new in the area. They're not connected well at all. They've moved there for employment. But somebody in a church nearby learns about Jake and his family, and they inform people in the church, and the pastor, who's a young woman, who's smart and compassionate and tough and wise, she comes to visit in the hospital, and she just lets them know that they are surrounded by this community who doesn't know them but is praying for them and aches with them. And then she just sits with them. And she doesn't stay long. And she says she'll be back if they would like. And they would. So the next day she comes back. And the day after that. And on that third day, Jake is very close to death. So she just sits with them. And she doesn't say much. She just listens. And she holds hands when they want to do that. And when people cry, she will embrace them. And she will cry with them. And when they say goodbye to Jake as he's dying, she joins them in weeping. She doesn't fall completely apart as they do. She recovers so that she is able to say a very brief prayer and hold them in that. At the funeral, there's this little white casket surrounded by stuffed animals and blown up photos of Jakey and Charlie, his five-year-old brother, laughing. And Charlie is just heartbroken, just devastated. Well, some weeks later, Charlie and his mom and dad joined that church that surrounded them, that cared for them, that brought them food, that prayed for them, that called on them. And Charlie is invited to come to Sunday school, but he doesn't want to. He's 5. He just sits with his dad there and draws pictures like a rocket ship that he wants to come to take him and pick up Jakey so they could go visit the stars. Sunday after Sunday, that goes on, and then one Sunday, he decides he wants to go to Sunday school. And so he shows up, and when he does, the teacher panics because the lesson that day is about the little girl that Jesus raised from the dead. And she thinks, what am I going to say if he asks why Jesus didn't raise my little brother from the dead if he could do that for that little girl? But she doesn't know what else to do. She's got her lesson prepared, and so it's like, okay, a little faith, and away we go. And she tells the story. And when she's done, it's real quiet. And then Charlie starts to speak. And it's his first time in this class with this group of pre-K through second graders. And they are a lively, busy bunch. But he starts to tell them that his little brother, Jakey, died too. And that Jesus raised him too. So now he's with Jesus. He is. And since Jesus is always with us, then Jakey is with us too. We just can't see him like we could before. And those little kids, who usually are all over the place, you know, swinging from the lights and climbing up the walls, they are absolutely still. Absolutely silent. And every bit of their attention is focused on their new classmate. And when he stops talking, this little girl, her name is Heaven. Her mom was on drugs during her pregnancy. And Heaven gets up and goes over to Charlie, and she doesn't say anything. She just wraps her arms around him and holds him, and just holds him, giving you the sense that maybe she knows what it's like to lose somebody she loves. And then the whole class, all these surround Charlie, and they take turns giving him hugs and telling him they're glad he's here and glad Jakey's here too. And then they go and do the same for his dad, sitting off in the corner on the floor in the room with tears just streaming down his face. And they hug him the same way. And Charlie is white, and he's blonde, and he's privileged. And Heaven is black, and she's beautiful, and she's poor. And this class is a mix of colors and ethnic backgrounds and socioeconomic status, all of that. But in that moment, they are one. And they are whole. And they have arrived at that place where God is calling all of us. They are complete. Jesus prays that his followers might be one, that they might come into the unity, the oneness, the completeness that he knows is God, and that all might know this. Isn't that what is happening? Isn't Charlie doing the same thing in his broken openness, in his vulnerability, in his trust, as he's telling them what has happened, and inviting that oneness that these children know, that we come from one and eventually we return to one. It's the thing that Jesus lived in this world that these children still retain. See, with Jesus, I don't think it was that he was given something special that nobody else had. I think he held on to what he had from the start, and he lived that in the world. And that's what changes things. And that's what these children were experiencing and sharing and embracing in each other. So, do you have an image in your mind of that Sunday school classroom and those children? Can you picture them? Take that image or those images and set them next to the images of what you have from what happened in that classroom in Uvalde, Texas. Now, how do we invite the one and not the other? How do we nurture the way to the one and not the other? Because right now, we are doing the opposite as a nation. We have chosen that course. And next time there is a mass shooting, as there will be, remember this prayer of Jesus, that all may be one as we are one, God. And ask yourself, do we have a prayer of getting to that place if we are not willing to be changed fundamentally, thoroughly, wholly, for God's sake? Amen.